This is Courtney Murphy, Manager Strategic Engagement for CECP, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on the Global Guide. For those of you who attended our summit just a couple weeks ago at the Time Warner Center in New York City, you heard from Carmen about our work in the Global Guide and appreciate all of your guidance and your participation as we've invested in our standards around global. And now it's my privilege to introduce Carmen Perez, who leads our research and measurement globally, for the overview of the Global Guide today.
Thank you, Courtney, and very excited to be here with all of you today. As Courtney mentioned, this is an extension of what we presented at CECP Summit. I'm really thrilled to be able to share some more information about the Global Guide as part of an expansion of what CECP is doing around measurement and our current corporate giving standard. The Global Guide is a tool for all companies working with CECP to think about how they report their global corporate contributions and can use that information for benchmarking. So we'd like to start with just some housekeeping. First, our agenda is that we'll be doing an introduction, just a bit about the project motivation. I'll talk a bit about our Global Guide reports. I'll then go through the Global Guide criteria to talk about what's different and what's the same and some details within each of the three criteria. We'll look at some international giving data, and then we'll be also taking your questions at the very end. So please do keep in mind that on your panel on the right-hand side, it says that you can enter a question to staff. At any point throughout the webinar, please use that to send questions in, and we'll address them at the end. So anything that pops into your mind as I'm talking, don't hesitate to send in a question so we can make sure that we tailor the information we're presenting to what you're most interested in. A couple other notes. We are recording. So a video of this webinar will be posted to CECP's YouTube channel at the conclusion of the session, available to other companies who weren't able to join us today. A couple key dates for you. The Global Guide submission, the deadline for that is July 15th. Also a CECP deadline. Our Excellence Awards application is available now, and the deadline is September 5th. Our follow-up materials from the summit are available on our events page on ccp.co. And as I mentioned at the beginning, please just do send us your questions as we're going through the presentation. So first, we just want to acknowledge and recognize something that we've heard throughout the development of the Global Guide, and that is that international giving is complicated. There are so many factors companies consider when building their international giving programs. There's vendors, there's vetting NGOs, dealing with intermediaries, dealing with cross-company communication through different regions and different subsidiaries, and it's a multitude of issues that companies address when thinking about how to expand their international giving to have a global footprint. That's not the focus of our presentation today, but something we certainly want to acknowledge and recognize that this reporting and benchmarking that we're addressing through the Global Guide is one piece of a larger picture for companies' international giving strategies. We do address these issues in other ways, and that's typically through peer-to-peer learning. So I just wanted to mention that at the summit in 2012, we had a session on the potential and the pathway, which we're getting into some of the challenges around reporting, and two that the Global Guide can help companies address are those around internal consensus for policies, as well as ownership around who should be responsible for reporting total global contributions. And this year at CECP Summit, we took a deeper dive into global giving structures and processes. There's 4 key strategies companies use for those, and we'll actually summarize that session and have it available in our summit materials online. So just kind of to take a big step back and say that CECP understands that the range of issues a company addresses when thinking about expanding their international giving footprint go far beyond reporting, and this is one piece of a bigger puzzle. But a very important piece of that puzzle. So just to reiterate, the Global Guide's primary purpose and objective is to help companies improve their reporting on global contributions, and the intention there is to create a benchmarking tool. Commonality among how data is reported improves benchmarking, and something that we want to deliver as we see our members increasing their international giving. The standard is not intended to be a policy recommendation or a legislative recommendation. It's not to discourage unique or strategic individual efforts that companies might be taking, but really to find that 90% consensus, the majority of what all companies are addressing internationally for the purpose of public reporting. And with that in mind, we'd just like to talk a little bit about the motivation behind the project. A phrase we use often in the States is we want to be able to compare apples to apples. And this is really important to talk about when thinking about the motivation behind the Global Guide and why we wanted to create this standard. Apples to apples comparison is essential for positive benchmarking. And as we're thinking about philanthropy and corporate contributions as a business function and that it needs to be treated as such, improving the way that companies are reporting is an effort we know you all are working on and something that CECP seeks to support. Of course, total contributions is not, there's no legislative requirement or regulatory requirement for audit. We know some companies do that voluntarily, but still there's this desire and this pursuit for companies to improve the way that they are reporting, and the idea is that we can compare apples to apples. So we'd ask everyone to just picture an apple in your mind. And now with this image, we'd like to know, or we would expect that none of you actually had this exact apple that we have here, or one of these apples that we have here in your mind when I said that. But it is quite easy for everyone to identify which of these 9 images are apples and which are not. Clearly there's different flavors, but we all understand this biological definition and have an understanding of what an apple is, and that allows to make sure that when you're comparing two, that you're kind of talking in the same family. So how does that translate to comparing total giving to total giving? This is really our shared objective, to bring that same level of understanding and commonality and companies rallying around one definition to that comparison. When you're looking at this image, can we identify the differences here of what's included or excluded? The Global Guide allows us to advance around common criteria. CECP as a standard setter has done this in multiple ways, so this is not new for CECP, but something that the Global Guide offers us to expand on how we're setting standards so that companies and the public and other stakeholders feel confident when they see a total giving number, they can understand what's included, what that means, and improve the transparency around reporting. So into the Global Guide. These are our 2 reports. The one on the left, the Global Guide to What Counts, is the guide itself. It has the 3 criteria, and it's a very short piece. It's just a quick fold out. It's available to you on our website for free, and that can give you the full criteria that the Global Guide cover. On the right, we've got our Developing the Global Guide to What Counts. This is a much more extensive report. It's for the inquiring mind to understand the full range of research that CECP completed together with Deloitte in order to produce these criteria. We have to take a moment for the history before we can dive into the details. So this is just a quick history. We've got the timeline here of when the Global Guide project started. As I mentioned, we did this together with pro bono assistance from Deloitte. Their international tax team provided some extremely important research and consulting in order to produce this standard. It was a very deep investment on the part of CECP, Deloitte, and all the companies and nonprofit partners around the world that invested in creating these criteria. One thing to highlight on this timeline is that there's a combination of 2 inputs here, research and practitioner engagement. They almost flip off between the different points on this timeline, and that is so important, I think, to creating a practical standard. It's based in research, rigorous research, but also has several touch points for the people who we intended to use the standard to weigh in and improve the criteria as they were being developed. The bottom portion is a snapshot of something from the report, Developing the Global Guide, to give an idea of what information is covered there. It has the list of 17 countries. We studied the countries with the highest concentrations of global 1,000 companies. And the report covers 12 key findings. And I want to mention that just because as you see the 3 criteria, it's good to know that the breadth of the research was much far beyond what those 3 criteria ended up concluding. So when we're saying that the Global Guide defines what counts, CECP obviously has a long history of this in our data collection through the corporate giving standard. And we wanted to at least present at the outset sort of where we were and what the Global Guide offers as a new standard. The current corporate giving standard asks companies to include giving to all 501c3 organizations. And then outside the U.S. to find the equivalent of a 501c3 and include those as well. So you can see here, we're putting these side by side so you can identify how the current corporate giving standard, which produces giving in numbers, collects data, and where the global guide allows the expansion to go. So now we're about to dive into the criteria. I take a deeper look at these 3 criteria that we're using to define which grantees should be included in total contributions. And before we do that, we just want to frame your thinking in 2 ways. The first is think about these criteria in terms of how they compare and align with your current policies and procedures to vet grantees. And secondly, what fields in your reporting system reflect this type of information? These should be in your mind, and we're asking you to frame your thinking in these ways because that's crucial to thinking about how you can apply these criteria for reporting and tracking purposes. So let's take the high-level view. The global guide criteria are 3. The first is that the recipient must be formally organized, the recipient must exist for a charitable purpose, and they must not distribute profits. So we're going to go through these 3 criteria one by one. This image is important because of the plus signs. It's identifying for you the fact that all 3 must be met in order for the grantee to be included. So the first criteria is that the organization must be formally organized. What we're doing here is identifying organizations which have a formal identity, and they are an institution that has enough legal standing in order to partner with your company to achieve your social objectives. We exclude individuals with this criteria, and we also exclude government recipients. The exception to that is schools. Public schools are included within the global guide standard as they are in the current corporate giving standard as well. This is a criteria which for most companies is a no-brainer. In order to cut the check to the partner, it has to have an organizational identity, so it's usually not a controversial criteria. I'll just give a couple examples of why it's really important to identify. For example, in Russia, there is actually a culture of giving to individuals. There's websites where you can identify a child in need or children who might be living in an orphanage and be able to give to them directly. Scholarships is another common one which might go directly to an individual, and we want to ensure that that type of gift is not included in order to make sure that, back to our original point, when someone's comparing total giving to total giving, we have a clear understanding of what type of contributions are within that number. There is no particular valid legal form. There's no requirement of a certain type of legal form that this criteria requires. Government recipients are excluded, which we can talk more about as we're going through the criteria. But an example that came up throughout public comment that companies often cite is giving to governments during disaster relief situations. We want to collect this data. We did not feel there was significant consensus among companies to include it in total contributions, and we want to collect the data on what contributions are going to governments in order to determine in the long run if this is a partner or a recipient type that's common enough among companies that we can create parameters so that it is included in total contributions. But for now, the conclusion was that it needs to be excluded, and we'll track it separately in order to determine its future. Just a note on that as well, that in our pilot, we're asking companies to report on that, and over 1/3 of companies did report that they do give to government recipients. At our summit just this June, we also asked a poll question of our audience, and we found that there as well, 1/3 of companies are giving to government institutions. So it's a minority, but something that we know is happening and something that we want to track for the future. So I'll just pause now to say, back to our original point about framing thinking. What in your policies and procedures already addresses this? How are you tracking this? Do you have a field for institution type? And just kind of keep that frame in your mind as we're thinking about these different criteria. The third criteria, I'm jumping here because the second one is a bit more extensive. And the third criteria is asking companies to distinguish commercial motives from non-commercial motives. The way that we phrase that is that the institution must never distribute profits. We'd ask everyone to place the emphasis and the focus here on the distribution versus the profits. The concept of profits, I think, can cause people to think that we're asking companies not to, or excuse me, grantees to not have any commercial activities or any unique sources of revenue. That's not the intention. It's really to make the distinction between commercial motives and non-commercial motives. And the factor that we're using to determine that is around distribution of profits to owners or investors within the organization. And we found in our research that that was actually a very common method for civil society to determine what type of organization we're talking about when we're talking about a charity or a potential grantee. So just to dive a little deeper on that, we feel that this is an extremely important criteria because clearly when we go through the charitable purposes, you can see that there are charitable purposes where it could be a business could have that same purpose. For example, housing development, or a lawyer could advocate on behalf of their clients. And we certainly don't want to have a total giving number which could include those type of businesses which have a commercial orientation. Another example that this criteria brings up are B corporations or social enterprises. So I'd give an example of Warby Parker, a very well-known B Corp that produces eyeglasses and also has a program of donating to improve access to visual correction for the visually impaired. So if you were having a financial transaction with Warby Parker, at this point the Global Guide would exclude that contribution. You may be supporting their distribution of glasses to those in need, but because the institution has a commercial motive, they are a B Corp, we're recommending that these are excluded from what a company is reporting in total contributions. The same caveat with the government exclusion is that we are tracking this information. We want to see how often are these types of organizations and unique institution structures part of what you would consider your charitable giving portfolio. We want to track that information because if we see significant momentum among companies and we can create adequate parameters in order to define when this type of contribution would be included in total giving, it's much easier to add in a contribution than it is to exclude it. So once again, we asked at the summit of our audience whether or not they're giving to social enterprises, and we found that 25% of companies in that audience do have partnerships with social enterprises or B Corps or any type of entity which is not, which might be organized for commercial purposes. And in our pilot, we found that 10% of companies could give us this data. Once again, a minority, and something that we're tracking through the Global Guide data collection study in order to keep our finger on the pulse of that and determine what it might look like for the future. So we'll pause here again to say, what in your tracking system or policies and procedures might address this type of criteria? It may already be there and it may not, and how could that create implications for how you might be able to apply the Global Guide internally? To go to the second criteria, this is that the institution must exist for a charitable purpose. This is building off of the first distinction, which is between commercial and non-commercial motives, to define really what do we mean when we say charitable. Charitable means one thing to an individual, and we found that charitable means a lot of different things to individual governments and regulations. So a significant part of our research was to look at all those different definitions of what is considered charitable at the country level and roll them up to determine which we should include when seeking to report total contributions across countries and across companies. What we're using to do that is the International Classification of Nonprofit Organizations. It's a United Nations tool in order to collect country data around civil society. So we feel that it's a credible external standard that we can use to define the categories that are included or excluded. What you've got in front of you now is a view of the different categories that are included in the Global Guide. Many of these are familiar. I imagine there's not many surprises here. And within each category, you see that we have examples. So these examples are not exhaustive, but just that. They're examples to add some color and definition around what should be covered within each of these categories. Education, extremely common, health, social services, environment, including environment and animal protection, philanthropic intermediaries and volunteerism promotion, and international, which is a unique category, but this is including cultural programs, international disaster relief, and things like that. We also have categories from the ICNPO which are excluded. This is political parties and organizations, business and professional associations, religious organizations, and any that are not elsewhere classified. We made this determination based off of the research that we conducted in partnership with Deloitte, as well as feedback through the public comment period. There was not significant momentum around these categories to say that they should be included in total giving, and so therefore any organization in these categories would be excluded. There's one exception here within religion, which is that contributions which are going to a charitable purpose but might be carried out by an organization with a religious mission or history are not excluded. So the classic examples here are soup kitchens run by a church, a pre-K program run by a synagogue, homeless shelter run by a mosque. Anything of that type would not be excluded because the contribution is actually supporting one of the charitable purposes of the Global Guide. So what's the difference? And when we say what's the difference, we're referring to CECP's longstanding history of gathering data through the Corporate Giving Standard and the Global Guide. We're taking a big step back here when thinking about our Corporate Giving Standard and its 501c3 definition to go straight to the source. So what does the IRS use when they're defining what could qualify as a 501c3? Here's one of the lists that I referenced that occurs at every country level to decide what would be considered charitable or not. You see religious, educational, scientific, literary. One is charitable, which is obviously problematic because that can mean so many things. And there's a definition there including relief of the poor, erecting or maintaining public buildings or monuments. And I should say we actually are going to be having a webinar coming up soon on the maintenance of public building and monuments because we know it's a very controversial category. I'm only joking. I'm just making that joke to highlight the fact that within every country's definition of what would be charitable and not, there's always some categories which are on that minority. They're on that list of exceptions, and you might not see that in the Global Guide. And the intention, as I said, is to find that 90% middle, that majority, in order to make benchmarking and reporting on total contributions extremely meaningful. And beyond the regulation, in the US, we also have the NTEE codes, which are gathered by the Urban Institute and the National Center for Charitable Statistics. This is another way to look at what might be included within a 501c3 definition. They have a much more extensive set of categories, and these codes are used by many companies internally to track where funds are going. And you can see that it goes far beyond what the 501c3 regulation includes. And allows to show the full breadth of really what can be included within charitable organizations here in the States. And I'm providing that frame because it's difficult. Some companies want us to say, these three things are excluded and that's the difference. And it's much more complicated than that. And yet the two standards are really highly aligned. So the difference is really that the 501c3 registration is a standard which relies on a national regulation. The benefit of that is that there's very clear parameters around what's included and excluded. The Global Guide is an expansion on looking at global contributions because we're looking at charitable purpose as a key way to create what's included and excluded. That categorization in the second criteria is how we do that. Now, there are certain categories which we can clearly identify from the U.S. standard of charitability and the Global Guide. One is religious organizations. And another is professional associations. So another key difference is that we can look at that 501c3, 501c categorization of the IRS to determine there might be other charities that now could be included within the Global Guide. Taking a deeper look there, 501c1, 14, and 16 are typically cooperatives. And I think we would argue that in that case, there is a distribution of dividends, and therefore they would be excluded. The 501c4 category is in the maybe category. All those organizations could use a second look. Those organizations are allowed to perform lobbying and advocacy that 501c3s are not. And it may be that they have a charitable purpose, but wanted that categorization in order to perform advocacy and lobbying. So they deserve a second look of inclusion or exclusion. And beyond that, in the 501c3 category, there's many mutual benefit and insurance organizations, groups of employees. And these would be excluded within the Global Guide. But this is just to kind of frame the fact that the big change here is that we're stepping away from pointing at a national regulation to allow across countries companies to be able to report using a common standard. So what's the same? I think most important here is to just highlight the fact that we do see these two standards as highly aligned. In our pilot, we found that companies that were part of the corporate giving standard that also reported against the global guide, their total contributions number was typically within plus or minus 2%. So there were differences at the margin, but they are highly aligned standards. Another thing that's the same is that we are using an external credible taxonomy, the ICNPO. In the CGS, we're using the NTE codes, the US-based standard. And there's really broad coverage of charitable recipients. As I mentioned, health, education, human services. These are common in the US as the major categories, and those are covered within the global guide. Public schools are included in both standards, and all government institutions are excluded beyond public schools. And as I mentioned, we're collecting data on that. So to just kind of bring this back around to where we started, when thinking about how your company could apply these criteria, it's really going back to thinking, kind of making an assessment of what your company is already doing around reporting and tracking of your grantee portfolio. It may be in your policies. You can clearly see that certain criteria are already met. It could be that there's a field or two in the reporting system that can produce the kind of information that you would need to determine if a recipient is included or excluded. Essentially, we think that there's two fields that would show this, and that's around program area and institution type, which may or may not already be in the system that you're using to track grantees. We understand that it's not that simple. That typically, for companies, you're working with several different departments when you're thinking about reporting on your grantee portfolio. It's not just one person who could make a policy change and then have that implemented throughout the company. You have many people inputting data. You may have finance involved, operations. So we understand that it's not a snap of the finger to make a change to how you're tracking. But we do think that those two key fields, regardless of the global guide, are an important internal measure to kind of keep tabs on where funds are going. CECP also created a flow chart or a decision tree to help companies think through whether grantees would be included or excluded. And back to our purpose, which is really around the fact that CECP is your benchmarking partner. We have an overarching theory around why benchmarking is important, and the global guide reinforces that reporting, understanding what counts, and then using that to report to an external study allows you to access benchmarking, which can really improve the way that you're addressing the issues that your company has identified as most strategic to your corporate responsibility priorities for the future. Some examples, we heard at the summit that a company through benchmarking data was able to get a significant budget increase. We have companies coming to us to compare focus areas and testing the uniqueness of their particular focus. Another really common use is adding context in a board meeting. Board members might not be familiar with the larger picture of corporate responsibility, and this can allow you to bring in other company data or industry data to enhance the presentation of your contributions performance. So the benefits, we just talked about benchmarking data, which we see the global guide as enhancing, which you can already access from CECP on that front. Collaboration, we use our data all the time to help companies find potential collaborators or even just to share best practices. An example from the summit is a company looking for other companies that are expanding their employee engagement internationally, and we can use the data we have to find potential companies that could have a meeting to sort of get into that process and structure and the conversations beyond the data. Leadership, the global guide is a new standard, and stepping forward to be one of the first companies to report against it is establishing your company as a leader. It's also where CCP looks when we're looking for things like summit panelists, et cetera. We want to see those companies that have stepped up and led in efforts like this. You're in good company. As you know, CCP has limits on what companies we allow to report to our standards. We think that produces quality benchmarking and also creates a really exciting community for you to be a part of. Recognition is really important. We certainly want to make sure you receive the credit for putting in the time and investment into measurements and quality measurements. We do that through company lists online and in print. And of course, transparency is a part of so many external rankings around corporate responsibility, and this just enhances that. The last benefit, consensus builder, is in italics because whether or not you participate in providing data for the 2012 Global Guide study, we have heard from companies that the Global Guide standard creates the opportunity internally to have a conversation around what NGOs or nonprofit partners are acceptable. It expands others in the company's minds around who you can partner with around the globe when you're trying to be more and more strategic with your giving. And it could be a reason to have a meeting with other departments around how can we advance our international giving policies. And we've heard that from companies, which is why I'm raising it. It was kind of an additional benefit that we found beyond that reporting and benchmarking piece. So we certainly hope that that will be the same for all of you as well. So to kind of go beyond sort of the big picture of it, let's look at the results. If you were at the summit, you saw some of these already. This is our 2011 data pilot, which we completed in 2012. This reinforces one of the key benefits of the Global Guide, which is that we're able to expand our pie. As we're using a pie chart here, that you can see the slice for the United States is shrinking, and those from other countries is increasing. We've got 30 companies here, but it was quite a significant presence with over $5 billion US in contributions reported in our pilot. So this is one example of the benefits that you can see being a part of the Global Guide study. Again, benchmarking. We're a broken record on that topic. You can see here the median among this sample, and using the Global Guide standard, was 39 million. The breakdown of giving to international end recipients is also quite significant. It's 44%. That's nearly moving up towards half of the portfolio. So this is a light touch on what kind of benchmarking information is available to you. This is a peek, actually, of what we already know about international giving through our corporate giving standard. A way to benchmark and see where your company falls. This is international givers, so only companies that have given to at least one international end recipient. We see that on average, that's 21% of a company's portfolio. And you can find your industries below to see where your maybe 10% or 2% falls and how that compares to your industry. At the summit, we also talked about what's driving international giving. And this is an audience poll to talk about what the audience felt was the strongest driver of international giving at their company. Revenue, employee footprint, bigger company strategy, or societal need. And I think that the fact that business and company strategy was the key factor here says that for every company, I think, that has an international footprint, it should be on your radar of thinking not only how to give more internationally, but be more strategic and of higher quality. And we think the Global Guide can contribute to that. So I'd like to pause here just briefly, if you'll bear with me. In order to show you what you can access online and how you can submit information to the Global Guide standard. So this is actually CECP's webpage. This is the way that you'd access My CECP. You're going to click on My CECP, which is over in the top right-hand corner. That will take you to the main My CECP homepage. From here, you'll click on Corporate Giving Standard. That's going to take you into the main Corporate Giving Standard home screen. And you'll see that I'm in Company A, so there's no company information released here. This is just an example and a test case that we have. This Global Guide data, this blue tab, is actually where you can enter global giving data. And this is what the environment looks like. So there's just 3 questions: total contributions, country data, and tracking trends. So whenever you click Answer Question, no. Okay. Sorry about that. I think I had it paused. So I'll just go back through one more time. You've got the homepage of CECP. My CECP is up in the corner. That's going to jump to your this is the My CECP homepage once you're logged in. This is the Corporate Giving Standard homepage, which you can access by clicking this link here or this link here. The Corporate Giving Standard homepage then has this bright blue tab, Global Guide Data. When you click on that, it will enter you into the environment where you can submit Global Guide data. This highlights that there's just 3 questions to be a part of the Global Guide study. Total contributions is a repeat of the question that we have in the Corporate Giving Standard, the difference being that now you will use the Global Guide standard to report. When you click on Answer Questions, every field will become live, so you can enter your information. You can save or submit. So submit is a note to CECP that you're done and that we can access your information. I'll just click cancel because we're not submitting anything. Country data is a new question that we don't ask on the Corporate Giving Standards Survey. We've got the full list of countries below where you can enter information. We also have a breakdown not available field. If you do not have country data, we would simply ask you to indicate the total for your headquarters, the United States, down below, and then put the balance and breakdown not available. So we have the differentiation between headquarters and non-headquarters giving. You can also send this by email. Some companies already have a country breakdown in Excel, and you can certainly email that to us and we'll enter it on your behalf. And as I mentioned in the presentation, we've got two key trends that we seek to track in the Global Guide study. That's around government institutions and for-profit businesses or social enterprises. What's really important here is that 0 and NA mean two very different things. 0 means that your company gives in this category but might not have in 2012. And then NA means that there is no giving and that's not part of your portfolio at all. And you can also report, obviously, a dollar value if you have an amount that goes to one of these two recipients. And once again, it's just an answer question, save, submit, or cancel if you're not submitting. And with that, that concludes the presentation. We're just reinforcing our deadline right here, and we want to thank you all for your attention, and we certainly hope that this has cleared up and provided you some interesting information on the Global Guide standard and the criteria and how you can apply them. And now we can take questions.
Great. Thank you, Carmen. I know I learned a lot from that as well. It's so nice to see how that can be of assistance to companies. We have a couple questions here that we can get to for those of you who can say. One is, why does the standard include an exception for public schools but not other government institutions? Can you expand on that?
Sure. So we found that in our public comment period, we actually asked a specific question about public schools. And there were very few things in the research that had 100% consensus. And one of them was actually the category of education. Across the board of the countries studied, education was an included charitable category. And we wanted to know, because schools are a major part of that picture and something that we're including in the corporate giving standard, how would that play out on an international level? So there was a specific public comment question about whether or not we should include government-run schools. And the resounding response, a supermajority or beyond, was that we should include them. So that's kind of the origin of why they're included on that point.
Great, thank you. I think there's a question here about whether the PowerPoint will be shared, and we'd be happy to share the PowerPoint as well. So thank you for that question. You mentioned social enterprises and giving to governments, but those numbers weren't on the slide. Can you review the percentages of companies that are giving to those?
Sure. So those two numbers were actually from two different places, because we did gather this information through our pilot. And also, we did the summit polls. So I mentioned that among companies that completed the pilot, 1/3, it was actually 11 of the 31, were giving to governments. And in our summit poll, we found actually a very close number, right around 1/3 as well, of the audience members. Their companies were also giving to government. So on the government front, it was around 33% of companies. And for social enterprises, the number was slightly different, actually, between the pilot results and the summit poll. The summit poll showed that 25% of audience members did give to social enterprises or businesses which have a charitable purpose. And in our pilot, we found that it was actually 10% of companies reported giving to social enterprises. We would think that this difference is related to the fact that they may be giving but not tracking. So we will look this year to see if those numbers sort of come a bit closer together.
Thanks, Carmen. And then you had referenced the flow chart for helping companies to decide if something falls in or not. Can you just tell people where they can find that flow chart?
Certainly. So actually, within the Global Guide, when you're completing it online, you can click on Get Help, which will actually take you to our company toolkit, which I can also email to everyone separately. And in here, there's a link to it, but it's available on our website. See if I can get there click here to access the decision tree. So you can use that link, and it's just a one-page flowchart decision tree to help you flow a recipient through and see whether or not they would qualify within the global guide. All right, well, if there's no more questions, we certainly will thank everybody for your time. We hope that this was beneficial to you. I'm going to send you a quick survey for all those who attended to just give us some feedback on the webinar. And we hope that we'll hear from you with any questions you have related to the Global Guide, International Giving, or any other CECP work in our benchmarking offerings.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.